This is a story of a Grail quest, one I unwittingly embarked upon by watching some very strange YouTube videos. It started with one called something along the lines of "Everything you know is a lie." This of course can't quite be true, since the video would be lying and pointing it out as well. But during the course of this video, the speaker referred to one of his commenters, who said that water is not what we think it is. This is very intriguing in light of a Grail quest, which I didn't know that I had embarked upon at the time, since water figures so prominently in the Grail legends as the medium of the Lady of the Lake and the location of a certain, what has been called, farcical aquatic ceremony. In the spirit of this farcical endeavor, which I didn't know I had embarked upon yet at the time, I watched some of this video and then tracked down the video from the commenter. He had tried to prove that water is not made of hydrogen and oxygen by attempting a calculation relying upon conservation of volume rather than conservation of mass. So he took what were supposed to be two samples of liquid hydrogen and oxygen and showed how much volume they would occupy, and that this would be much too much volume. Ironically, one of the figures he used was for compressed oxygen still in a gaseous state rather than a liquid state. I looked up oxygen in a liquid state and found that it's actually, when brought to these temperatures, minus approximately 200 degrees Celsius, somewhat denser than water, and by an interesting ratio. One of these ratios that comes up in many ways in spiritual quests, and is repeated in concepts such as the seven heavens. This is the number 7. Oxygen in liquid form at these extremely low temperatures is denser than water by a factor of 1/7. It is 1 1/7 times as dense as water. And now hydrogen, on the other hand, is much lighter when it's in liquid form, and the commenter had this number right. It's about 1/14 as dense as water in our liquid form at our temperatures and pressures that we see it in everyday life. But to make the water from hydrogen and oxygen, you'd have to have twice as much hydrogen as oxygen. So you have 2 units of something that is 1/14 as dense as regular water. There was this passionate debate between this man called Cheeps and Neeps, who had an extremely thick Scottish accent, and a man with a other slightly British accent, not nearly so obvious, who tried to point out the errors of Cheeps and Neeps using traditional chemistry, as we are taught in schools, and which seems to be backed up by experimental evidence. They overlooked, I think, a strange correspondence that Cheeps and Neeps had actually stumbled upon. The argument he was actually trying to make, and which was undermined by his own use of the wrong source of the oxygen data. This is that if you take the average of the densities of the hydrogen and the oxygen, if you could somehow balance it out a little bit, the oxygen is 1/7 too heavy, the hydrogen is 2/14, 1/7 of the weight of what you're trying to end up with. So, if you could use one to lighten the other one up, you would actually get what Cheeps and Neeps was striving to prove with his false arguments, as I would see it. This is that you would end up with something much like the density of water. The means you would have to use to get it, though, would be a little bit like one of the episodes that these men were echoing in their manner of arguing back and forth, which is like a scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail in its absurdity. The argument was much like the one that opens the film, where Patsy and Arthur come to a castle and want to get in, and are distracted by the guards, who begin an argument about how coconuts would get to England, possibly being carried by swallows. Now, in this case, you have one sample of water, this element, which the element, to use Sheeps and Neeps languages, this compound, which is held by things like grails, which can be made its proper density from liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. If you averaged out the density by combining the densities in the proper proportions. Oxygen is a little too heavy, hydrogen is a little too light, but you have 2 units of it. You have twice the quantity of H2 to be combined with 1 quantity of O2. So you can imagine in your mind the O2 being like a giant coconut, and the 2 units of H2 like 2 swallows, much less dense, trying to collectively lift the coconut by its husks and reduce its overall average density to the point where it would be like that of water and would be able to float. Or, in your imagination, carried, lightened somewhat, reduced in density by the upward pull of the hydrogen swallows. This got me along the path of wondering, could I somehow discover how the coconuts actually could have gotten to Britain? I looked up some references on this and have found that there have been instances of coconuts washing ashore on the western shores of the British Isles. It's hard to tell, however, whether these come from ships or whether they come from sources in the Caribbean. It is conceivable that a coconut washed loose from a tree in the Caribbean could make its way via the Gulf Stream across the Atlantic to Europe, and thereby supply Arthur with his source of coconuts. However, I did some more research into this and found that coconuts have only been in the West Indies since about the 16th century, which would make them too recent to fit in to a strictly Arthurian timeline in which King Arthur lives in about 535 AD. Now, there are other possible sources. I found another article discussing another element of this question of how Arthur got his coconuts. And this one said that there was a trade in coconuts going back as far as Roman times, and that by the time about the 1500s came around, English people who had a long tradition of wood carving were making cups out of coconuts, and going so far as to decorate them with silver and gold, to line them, as it were. This led me, of course, to the next stage in the discovery of in what became my grail in a fashion. This is that some of these coconut cups could have been extremely valuable and treasured items, coming so far as they did from sources in Africa, the Middle East, India. The Middle East especially symbolically important because it's where the original Grail would have come from in the story of the crucifixion. So like the Grail itself, the coconut would potentially follow a similar path, coming from a warmer and distant climate. But this would change the comic underpinnings of the entire movie. The coconut joke is a run-on gag that occurs and is echoed and shows up again several times in the course of the movie, often in connection with castles. The knights are mocked from the tops of castles. First, in the absurd discussion about the source of the coconut and the delivery by swallows. Again, in the Castle of Maidens, because the Grail is a feminine symbol, and they go to a castle that's full of feminine occupants, and which they claim to have had a grail-shaped beacon atop. Then they're mocked again by a group of knights who jokingly say that, "We'll tell our master about your quest, but I don't think he'll be too keen because he's already got one." This brings about, it seems to me, the possible basic comic underpinning of the film, which hides in plain sight and which is almost discussed overtly by all the sources that I read through on my way to this realization. It's quite simple. What if Arthur was carrying the Grail, or even two of them, with him the whole time? Coconuts are treasured objects, decorated with silver and gold, come from the same place, and knocked together, of course, at the beginning. If you had two of them, that would echo the episode with the knights with the French accent and other castle events in the movie. Meaning that the quest was completed before it began.